So thank you very much to the Society for inviting us to come talk. My name is Jason Reeves. I'm the Policy and Communications Manager at the Chartered Institute of Ecology and Environmental Management. A little bit about me as background. My background's in ecology, but for the last 11 years or so, I've been moving more and more into environmental and ecological policy. I'm going to talk a bit about Brexit and the implications for professional ecology. So it's off on a tangent, really, from other things that are on the agenda today, but I hope you find it interesting. One caveat, I'm not a lawyer. Other lawyers in the room, I'm not a legal expert, but this is our interpretation of where things are at the moment and where they might be going. So a little bit about SIEM, if you're not aware of it. We're the professional membership body for professional ecologists and environmental managers in the UK and Ireland. Most of our membership is in the UK, but we have got a fairly reasonable minority in Ireland as well, and then a few members dotted around the world as well. Our vision really is to get to a point where society values the natural environment, but then also values those people who are managing it and protecting it. We were established in 1991, so this is our 25th anniversary. We're really young in comparison to organisations like this, probably most of the other organisations represented in the room. But professional ecology is actually a really young profession as well. But we've come a long way in those 25 years, as the next line shows, in that we have a royal charter now for the last 3 years, and we have the ability to bestow chartered ecologists and chartered environmentalists on individuals that reach certain competence. We have over 5,000 members from a really diverse background. One of our strengths is that they do come from all sorts of sectors, so central government, local government, the agencies, the statutory nature conservation agencies, industry, consultancies, teaching, research, all over the place. And one of our great strengths is that we get input from a whole range of sectors that influences how we do things and our policy on work. And then obviously the things we actually do is working to advance understanding and standards of practice. We do that through guidance, training, conferences, position papers, publications, newsletters, that sort of thing. So in terms of the referendum, I just want to talk a little bit about what we as an institute have been doing. Before the referendum, we realised that actually this has huge implications. Most of the UK's environmental legislation is derived from the EU, so we obviously thought, okay, we're going to need to do something about this. So we set up a steering group. We set up an initial scoping workshop and realised actually this is huge and there's so much for us to think about, and that the broad scope of it is going to be massive, and we're going to have to focus this down somehow. The next thing we did was we surveyed our members to find out what their thoughts were on this, and we came back, actually, we took an initial stance on this in that we would be quite neutral about it and independent, as most other professional bodies and NGOs have been. But when we surveyed our members, 93% of them came back and said, well, actually, the EU has been really beneficial, and actually we would like to stay in the EU. And our governing board then took that as a mandate to say, well, actually, let's have a position on this then, and we'll say that we would like to stay in the EU. So we put out a position paper before the referendum and said, actually, the EU has been really good for environmental legislation, and we think we should stay. Post-referendum, after we got over the shock, we did think about this, and we put together two statements, and we had a statement for if we stayed and a statement for if we left, and we really did think we were going to use that one for staying, but obviously it didn't happen. So we put out a statement basically saying, okay, it's happened, wasn't what we wanted, but it's happened, and let's look at it as an opportunity. And then following that, there's quite a lot of turmoil, obviously, in the press and our members and clients of members, so we had to put out something else as well, saying that actually we're still in the EU, that legislation all still applies, nothing has changed, but it may or will in the future. We also soon realised that having a steering group for the referendum and having a policy group that looked at all kind of high-level policy issues were probably going to be looking at the same thing. So we merged those two groups, and now we just have the strategic policy panel, and 90% of what they're doing is Brexit. We put out another position paper post the referendum as well, and I'll come back to that later on, talking about what we'd like to see going forward in the run-up to an actual Brexit. We've started to engage with parliamentarians as well, so we've written to all the parliamentarians for the UK, so MPs, MSPs, AMs, MLAs, outlining our concerns and how we might potentially be able to help them and give them some advice. with a mixed response, but we have had some who come back and said, actually, I would like to know more and it'd be really useful. Obviously, part of our remit as well as we've been responding to consultations and inquiries from select committees, the most recent one from the Environmental Audit Committee on Brexit and the natural environment, and their particular focus was on agri-environment schemes, and I'll come back to that as well, but obviously there's others. Science and research, I think funding was one that another recent one that we've responded to. And after that, we've put out the initial statement, we've had a look at what the scope of the thing is. We realised actually we need to focus in on a few other topics. So we've set up 7 working groups, and they've started to look at particular issues that are of concern to us and to nature conservation, and I'll come back to those as well because they've started to formulate some ideas of where our concerns are. And then next month as well, the next step in the process for this is we're having a high-level meeting where we've invited our patrons, our past presidents, and our governing board to come together and talk about this. And that's actually going to be a really useful meeting from our point of view because within our patrons we have 2 peers from House of Lords. Within our past presidents we have people who are high up in NGOs and consultancy. So we should get an interesting view on what it is we need to do to move forward and how we can actually move forward in the best way. So implications for professional ecology, well, at the moment it's still business as usual. European legislation still applies, nothing has changed, it still needs to be implemented, you still need to be compliant with it, there's still a comeback on you if you don't. But there is uncertainty for the future, and in particular that button, Article 50, that Theresa May keeps saying she's going to delay. Next year sometime we press that. When that button gets pressed, we've got that 2-year period before we leave, and at that point where we leave, things change as well dramatically. And also the European Communities Act will need to be repealed, and that then takes away that supremacy of EU law over UK law, and that changes things as well. For the ecology sector, the crux of things for us really is the nature directives. That's the Habitats Directive and the Wild Birds Directive, and they pretty much underpin the sector and everything that's done in the sector. There are a few others as well, but they are pretty much the core of the work that is done. The unfortunate thing, though, is that at the point where we leave the EU, they're probably not going to be kept. And the reason for that is that under most trade agreements that we might potentially have with the EU, nature conservation is something that's carved out and not kept. So they're not applicable. But it's not all bad news, and I'll come back to that. So one thing I do need to mention quickly about primary and secondary legislation in the UK, in that at the point where we leave the EU, anything that's EU-derived, that's primary legislation, so an act of parliament, so something like, for example, the Wildlife and Countryside Act, which does implement bits and pieces of the Habitats Directive, remains in law. It would have to be, Parliament would have to actually repeal that for it no longer to apply. But secondary legislation, so UK regulations and orders, if they're implementing something from the EU, they would fall away at the point where we leave the EU. So there's some consideration to be done there. And in particular, wider environmental directives, so I've listed, sorry, it's terrible with acronyms, the Environmental Impact Assessment Directive, the Strategic Environmental Assessment Directive, the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, and the Water Framework Directive, and there's others as well, are all implemented in the UK through regulations. So at the point where we leave the EU, they fall away. So there's some concern there. Although I think all 4 of those, if I remember correctly, if we were to go for something like the European Economic Area Agreement, whether we do or not, I think they all still apply. So there are differences here. Another quick one, we've had something on EU regulations already. They're all written in Brussels, so the difference to UK regulations, at the point where we leave the EU, they fall away, and we've had one example already. Obviously the one I was thinking of was the invasive species regulation, so it's written in Brussels. It's a list of species that we have to prevent, eradicate, or what's the other one? Avoid. But that falls away. That's something that's written in Brussels and that we have to implement and is binding on us, but it falls away. There is an impact, a wider impact on ecology and environmental management as a business sector as well, and this comes more from the free movement of people and services, in that at the point where we leave the EU, there may be implications on the free movement of people and services. This is an unknown for us at the moment, but it has implications for if you're an environmental consultancy and you want to provide your services somewhere else in the EU, there are implications there, and there are implications there for the UK economy. It's a small part of the economy, but there are implications there. Case law. I'm not a lawyer, but my understanding of this is that at the moment, because most of our environmental legislation comes from the EU, most of our case law that basically guides on how we use that legislation is also set at an EU level. So all of those judgments at an EU level, at the point where we leave the EU, are no longer relevant. So we have this huge mass of law, of case law, that basically tells us how to implement the laws and how we should understand them. That all falls away. But the process then is, well, do we then go through the process of going through courts again every time there's a disagreement or an argument or a misunderstanding, of resetting all of that in domestic courts? Or does the government say, well, actually, that's a really useful body of knowledge that we transfer over? But at the moment, we don't know. Training needs, obviously, SIME is a training provider. At the moment, we provide training on the Habitats Directives, the Habitats Regulations, the Water Framework Directive, a whole range of those things. We don't know how they're going to change, but obviously our members are going to need to implement whatever comes along in the future, whatever changes. That's a big unknown for us, it's a big unknown for our members, it's a big unknown for the sector. And then funding is another concern. Obviously, the people in the room here obviously will have a much better idea than I do on research funding and how that's going to change, and things in the media are already saying that might already be changing and not for the better. We have other concerns as well with things like life funding, particularly for nature conservation. I know in Wales they've done an estimate on how much funding it would take for them to get their European sites to favourable conservation status, and it's in the hundreds of millions of euros, and there's a question then of where that money will come from if and when we leave the EU, and then structural funds as well as a potential concern. So having said all that, I think we still need to be positive, and there are still ways that we can look forward and say, okay, this has happened, it's not necessarily what we wanted, it's hugely frustrating, but let's see it as an opportunity, and potentially an opportunity to make things better. And I think one of the good things from a nature conservation point of view, as China's already said, is that the environment's pretty low down on the government's list of priorities, and with everything else they've got to consider here, it's probably something that they're going to say, okay, we'll just keep it. And then there is obviously international reputation to consider, in that how would we look to the rest of the world if we decided to weaken protections? And then public opinion, we've seen how the public have reacted to things like the forestry sell-off, and I don't know if you're aware of last year about things like the nature directives, and the European Commission got 500,000 responses basically in favour of keeping the nature directives as they are. So there are positives. One of the complexities for the UK, though, is that the environment is a devolved competence. So each of the countries in the UK, England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, can do as they like effectively for the environment. The EU legislation at the moment, though, provides a framework which keeps all of those things quite similar, which means that if you're working in the UK, there is a certain amount of similarity, and if you're working across borders, it doesn't diverge too much. But Brexit could mean that these countries can go off and do their own things entirely, and then they probably will diverge more. At the moment, we've already seen some of that divergence. Wales has been really, really progressive, in particular with 2 new acts pushing them out in their own direction. Scotland and Northern Ireland have both got biodiversity plans to 2020, and England is somewhere lagging behind. Government keeps going on about a 25-year plan for the environment, which we now understand is going to be split into one for the environment and one for farming, which is crazy, but that's what they plan to do. The latest I've heard from this is that this still isn't going to be published until next year, which means there isn't really a plan for the natural environment in England. And then obviously there are implications as well for Ireland, in that we will potentially have a land border with the EU, and that whatever happens in Northern Ireland is going to have implications for the Republic and vice versa as well. There are concerns in that there are European sites that straddle the border, and how will management of those sites work, and how will funding for those sites work. And then there's also things like the Water Framework Directive, which works at catchment level, and there are catchments that cross the border as well, so how will management of water like that work? And then obviously we've heard about international obligations, we've heard about the CBD, and the Nagoya Protocol without the S, sorry. That's obviously still an obligation on us outside of what happens with Europe. The Berne Convention as well is still an obligation, and this is where I come back to the Habitat Directives. Although the Habitat Directives themselves aren't applicable if we leave the EU, they actually effectively implement the Berne Convention, which is protection of European species, and that will still apply. So there's big chunks of the Habitat Directives that will still apply. There's the Ramsar Convention as well. Excuse me, many of our European sites, our Natura 2000 sites that are wetland sites, are also Ramsar sites. So there is another level of protection. It's not as good as the European level, but there is there. And then CITES is one that's a little bit of concern for us that we might have to look into further, in that my understanding now is that most of what happens for the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species is through European regulations. So at the point where we leave the EU, they may not apply, but we still have that obligation, so we'd have to find some way of bringing that into domestic legislation. So coming back to what was in our position paper, we basically said that at the moment there's this huge uncertainty. We don't know where we're going, and we would like to know where we're going. The UK government isn't too forthcoming on that. Hopefully that will change at some point, but what we'd really like to see, and as I've alluded to earlier, is that there is so much for the government to do in terms of legislation that is intertwined with EU legislation that it just isn't possible within that 2-year time frame to unravel all of it, to look through all of it, decide what to keep, decide what to change. That the easiest way forward would be basically just to say, with environmental legislation, let's just roll it over. Let's have enabling legislation, so that at the point where we repeal the European Communities Act, let's have something else in place that just brings all of that over as well. And then let's take a step back and say, okay, let's have a vision for the future. Let's look at 25 years, 50 years, and say, what would we like to achieve at those kind of time scales? And then look at the legislation and say, well, what do we need to do to achieve that long-term vision? I think that helps government as well, particularly with austerity cuts, and that government departments are much smaller, particularly departments like DEFRA. It means they're not having to do that huge amount of work now. They can just roll it over, carry on with the processes that are working, and then we can take our time and look at and change things in a positive way and look at the opportunities. So some of the specific concerns I mentioned earlier about, we set up working groups for some of the things that we're particularly interested in. So these are the groups that we've set up, and I'll just go through some of the concerns that we have here. So agricultural policy and land management. The common agricultural policy is something that government is going to have to replace. My understanding is that certainly for England, farm payments have been guaranteed until 2020, but beyond that, there will have to be some kind of replacement or some kind of new scheme to replace that in terms of farm subsidies. I don't want to use that word, but that's what they use at the moment. There is an awful lot of pressure as well to change the way that we look at farm payments, and that we should be looking at them as a payment for a public service rather than supporting or subsidising the farming industry. The National Trust has come out and said that that's what they'd like to see, and I think it is the way we're moving forward. So that brings us on to the actual funding mechanism, Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. So Pillar 1 at the moment with agricultural funding is the vast majority of the funding, and that's basically just to keep agricultural land in good condition so that you can use it for farming. And then Pillar 2 is the small amount which is used for agri-environment schemes and nature conservation and that sort of thing. There's going to be a lot of pressure from government, from Treasury, to take that Pillar 1 money and say, well, we'll take that in, thanks, and we'll use it for something else maybe, or potentially pressure from a farming lobby to say, well, actually, we'd like that money just to keep paying it to us. So from a nature conservation point of view, our argument needs to be that we'd actually like to use that money, and let's pull it into Pillar 2 or whatever that happens to be in the future, and say let's use that for nature conservation and for environmental benefit and for social benefits, for things like ecosystem services and paying farmers to manage their land in a way that helps those things going forward. We certainly need a simpler system. At the moment we have a level of bureaucracy at the EU level, and then we have a domestic level as well, and potentially even local level somewhere. We need a much simpler system to allow farmers, landowners, land managers to do the kinds of things that in some cases they do want to do. They do want to be helpful, to provide that public benefit, but in a way that isn't onerous. And we need to be outcomes-based rather than prescriptive. Rather than telling them what they should be doing, we should be telling them what they should be achieving. And that also works in terms of defining spatial targeting, in that if we wanted to address something like flooding, say, we have to have some kind of spatial targeting of how that would work and getting everyone in that land area to do the same thing. We do, however, need better regulation and better enforcement. That's a serious flaw at the moment in the system in non-compliance, and there's no repercussions generally on those kinds of things. But we do need to remember that the current scheme does have its good aspects, and we should be looking after those and keeping them. Protected species, there is an opportunity here to update the process, to improve the process. We've all seen headlines in newspapers about one newt or one bat costing £10,000 to a developer, or delaying it for a year or something like that. There is an opportunity for us to take the protected species legislation and improve it, and improve the planning system and the licensing system so that it's much better and more effective, and actually better for nature conservation as well. The current legislation, is considered to be adequate. It does work. The reviews that DEFRA have done, and the reviews that the European Commission have done, have said that the legislation and directive actually work, and it's the national implementation and interpretation that changes, and that's what people get frustrated about. So there is an opportunity here to improve things like that. There's also an opportunity for us to look more widely at biodiversity. Instead of saying, okay, let's pick out a few species, let's look more widely at biodiversity as a whole. And we do have, at the point where we do change species legislation, we have national legislation for nationally protected species under the Wildlife and Countryside Act. So we could take what's currently the European protected species and move them into the national and domestic legislation. But there would be an opportunity as well there for us to raise the level. So at the moment we look at environmental European protected species, and we think they're on this really high level, and then we think of domestically protected species. There's an opportunity for us to take those nationally protected species as well and move them up, and say, okay, well, let's put everything in one pot nationally in domestic legislation, but let's improve the protection and then the recognition. There is a risk of deregulation, as I've said. There is those media reports and the lobby to say, well, actually, why am I doing this for one newt? Why are we holding up a whole housing development for one newt or one bat or whatever it happens to be? So there will be a risk of deregulation. But all of the UK governments, devolved governments, have reiterated that they don't want to weaken legislations or water down protection. So that's good as well. The Law Commission's Wildlife Bill, so as a slight aside, a couple of years ago the Law Commission were asked to take all the wildlife legislation in England and Wales and see if they could bring it into one piece of statute. So at the moment we have lots of little bits of statute, and they were asked to look at bringing it all into one. There's an argument at the moment now saying that actually it'd be really useful if we could enact that bill and create it as an act of Parliament. And it would bring everything together. It would make things much simpler for us to roll it forward. It would make things much simpler for us to review things post-Brexit in terms of changing it. Probably two slight issues there. That one is that, well, Parliament probably doesn't have the time to do it, and probably doesn't have the interest in it either. And two is that because it wraps up England and Wales have been going off on their own path in many ways, may not want to do something that binds them in with England as well in the one particular piece of statute. And here as well, we need better monitoring. Like with agriculture, we don't really know. We have a very poor evidence base in many ways, in that the mitigation work that is done for protected species in relation to things like housing and road building, developments, whatever, we put in a lot of mitigation. It costs a lot of money, but then we don't know whether it works or not. We need to understand what works and what doesn't, and then use that to create future legislation. And then obviously migratory species are a concern as well, and how we will consider those in things post-Brexit. So protected sites, terrestrial at the moment. Natura 2000, so our European designated sites, need to be retained. They're all designated for a particular reason, for some kind of designation. So it's a bit of a no-brainer that we would lose them. We do need to keep them. Terrestrially, there is the benefit that most of them are designated as triple SIs, sites of special scientific interest as well. So there is another layer of protection, should the European legislation fall away, but we would hope not. But then we need to remember that there's an opportunity here as well, in that the European sites are just a sample of habitats, and that actually there are a lot of other sites that we could be protecting as well. So there's an opportunity for us to bring those in as well, potentially. We certainly need strong regulation and enforcement here as well. And then we need to consider the land borders, as I mentioned earlier, with Ireland, and how that will change. Marine protected areas, so an extension of the terrestrial ones before. There isn't underlying protection for them, so the SSSIs on land, there's no equivalent designation really in the marine environment. There is an option for the government, if they were to do away with that, in that they could replace them with marine conservation zones. They've already been through that process with some, but it has been a really drawn-out, expensive, complex process. Part of the issue with that is that in the marine environment, there are a huge number of stakeholders in compared to the land, and it takes time, and it just becomes a really, really expensive ongoing process. And obviously in the marine environment as well, there's concerns for migratory species. Fisheries management, like the Common Agricultural Policy, government will need to find some kind of a replacement for the Common Fisheries Policy. And they'll need to work out how they manage fish stocks, how they work out quotas, how they work out access, whether we still allow EU fishing vessels into our waters or not, as the case may be. We need to provide wider consideration for freshwater fisheries. The emphasis at the moment in terms of freshwaters has been on things like water quality, and we need to have an emphasis on the actual fisheries as well, the species. And then there are links with fisheries to other bits of EU legislation that we'll need to take into consideration as well. So things like the Water Framework Directive and catchment management. And agriculture as well is obviously a really big one in terms of runoff, nitrates and eutrophication, soil erosion, that sort of thing. Invasive species we've talked about before. There are existing international obligations. My understanding is that there is something in the CBD as well, but there's also something in the Habitats Directive. But we need to value that what we have in place at the moment is also really good, and that we shouldn't lose that. I've mentioned earlier about EU regulations. At the point where we leave the EU regulations fall away, so there's one on invasive species. We need to work out how we replace that and how we continue to collaborate with Europe and the rest of the world. There's a risk around new trade agreements as well. So as the government moves forward with organising, negotiating new trade arrangements, probably not so much with Europe, but with the rest of the world as well, there might be an incentive there to create easy trade agreements and arrangements that make it easy to bring goods into the country. There's a potential concern there with it making it easier to bring invasives in and pathogens and things like that as well. So it provides us an opportunity to increase those if we wanted to. We are an island, with the exception of Northern Ireland, so we could increase those protections as well, those measures. And then obviously with the devolved administrations, there's potential for those things to diverge, but it would be in their interests to keep them compatible with each other at least, and I mentioned Ireland. And then water resources and air quality. This is something that, the air moves. We're going to have international collaboration on water and air. Our concerns mostly with that are that most of the EU legislation is applied in the UK through regulations that potentially would fall away, but depending on the trade agreement, hopefully most of those would stay, but it is a concern. So a quick summary. It is business as usual. All the legislation applies. Everything still needs to be complied with, and there are repercussions if you don't. But there is this huge uncertainty. We don't know where we're going and how things will change, and it'd be really nice if government could give us some kind of clarity on where we are going, on time frames, and on how things might change. I think we still need to stay positive, and we still need to look at this as an opportunity, however frustrating that might be. And really what we're asking for, and what others in the sector are asking for, is that we have some kind of enabling legislation to just carry on environmental legislation into the future. And then we can take that step back and say, right, where do we want to be in the future? And let's review the legislation then to get there. Thank you.